Well, good evening, everyone in Alberta, Canada, and beyond. It is Wednesday, March 22nd, 2023. Spring has finally arrived. Hopefully, we'll have a few people watching. I know it's so nice out here in Alberta. My name is Kerry Lambert, and I welcome you to an online webinar evening of solutions for a new Alberta, brought to you by the Alberta Prosperity Project, also known as APP. Our purpose is to educate, inspire, and unite all Albertans, businesses, and organizations to protect their prosperity, individual freedoms, rights, and sovereignty by empowering the Alberta government to restructure Alberta's relationship within Canada. Of course, we couldn't do this without your help. If this is your first time watching, welcome, and I hope you find this information engaging and wanting to find out more. And if you're a regular APP webinar viewer, thank you for your support. We couldn't do this without you. APP is a membership driven with a goal of 1 million plus members to help steer the political process. APP memberships are 1 year for $20, 2 years for $30, 3 years for $40, or you can make a donation at albertaprosperityproject.com. We also have APP merchandise at our Alberta Prosperity Store, which apropos is called albertaprosperitystore.com. Tonight's webinar is entitled Free to Fly with our guest Greg Hill, who is a pilot and co-founded the society called Free to Fly, and you can find out more at freetofly.com. This is a live webinar, so we encourage you to this is a live webinar, so we encourage you to ask questions and make comments throughout this presentation. Just put 3 question marks before your question, so it'll be flagged and we can quickly view the questions and go through the comments. And with that, I'll bring Greg on now. Hello, Greg. How are you?
Hey, Kerry. I'm doing well, and thanks for having me on.
Good. I think I actually said freetofly.com, but isn't it freetofly.ca?
It is .ca. I'm not sure what's at Free to Fly. It may be like a chicken company or something. So better go to .ca.
That's funny. So if for a little bit of information, Greg's aviation dream was born at when he was age 13, and he spent 30 years flying, first in the military with multiple deployments around the world, including 3 to Afghanistan, then with a major Canadian airline, which sidelined him from flying and it threatened termination in 2021 over health freedom. Greg is passionate and about freedom in general, which led to the founding and co-directing of Free to Fly. He spends the bulk of his time fighting for the freedoms of every Canadian coast to coast. So with that, tell us a little bit about yourself with that.
Well, yeah, that's a broad question.
Yeah.
Well, without going back too far, I grew up in a military home. My father was an Army guy. The only reason I mentioned that is it probably helped inform my views of liberty from a very young age.
That's great.
As you said, spent a bunch of time in the military and then off to the airlines. So I'll fast forward without boring people with my teens and 20s and 30s. But 2021, the spring of, stepping back to 2020, just kind of the genesis of my COVID era, which kind of defines all of our lives these days. Yes. I was chairing a private school board at the time, and that was probably the genesis of my questioning, certainly of the policy aspects, because I saw what we were planning to do with the kids. And I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to spreadsheets and otherwise. So I literally sat in my basement. I pulled up only government data. I wasn't digging around in the nether regions of the internet. I strictly pulled up government data. I did a bit of data analysis for half an hour, and I thought, what on earth are we doing?
Yeah.
So that started the journey, along with the concerns of the shocking acquiescence of the Canadian population as a whole. And then as we moved into 2021, I remember it like it was yesterday. I was out for a run and kind of doing some chin-ups in a park or something, and I got thinking and thought, I'd been thinking, the government is putting this vaccine policy, like all their eggs are in one basket here.
Yeah.
Like what happens if this doesn't actually work? Never mind all the questions, without going too deep down the vaccine or the jab, as we prefer to say, down that road. What happens if it doesn't work out? And then, the gears started turning, and I thought, we've really got to start doing something. So we reached out initially to the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom. Lisa Bildy there was great with sitting down with us on a Zoom call and just providing a bit of education as to the charter, which, man, that's been an education this past 2 or 3 years. We won't turn this into a charter conversation, but not quite the document we all thought it was it? No. And the problem with that really is this idea that the government gives and takes our freedoms, which is very foundationally problematic, I would say, for Canadian citizens as a whole. These are God-given freedoms. The government doesn't give and take them. So anyway, out of that, there was a small group of pilots that started that, morphed quickly into what we call aviation professionals across the industry. And then really we wanted to position ourselves as advocates for Canadians in general. So it morphed into over 40,000, roughly 40,000 passengers and 3,000 aviation professionals. And the bulk of those passengers were disaffected passengers who were no longer passengers for the better part of a year. Right. Yeah. Well, and some tragic stories out of that. In the sense of not just family separation, but the inability to honor loved ones during their dying moments or other major life events, right? So that's kind of where Free to Fly, that's where it was born out of, and it's been a real journey. Many of these aviation professionals, along with countless thousands of others across the country, lost their jobs and remain out of work, or lost their jobs along with millions in income collectively over that year, right? Yeah. So there's the website, which is about to be revamped and completely changed, but that's what it is for now. So
there's a lot of great information on here. Let me tell you that. Yeah, I looked through there, and there was the one in particular. I have it opened up in a separate folder here. There's that. Yeah, there's a link off to here about where people can fly to, because obviously that is a big, that's probably the number one question I think we've had before you came on here was, where can I fly to? And because we're supposed to be free to fly, et cetera, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's a fantastic website. With that, just full disclosure, I had nothing to do with the design of that, nor did anybody at Free to Fly. That's just a link, but it's probably one of the best ones I've found, because as you said, you can literally put in there whether you're jabbed or not, where you want to go.
And if you're a U.S. citizen, or what kind of passport you have, and where do you want to go, and so just toggle on and off about if you're vaccinated, you can go there.
And look at that orange colored country. The great big one south of us that's very similar to, I don't know, Pakistan, Angola, and a couple other similar countries.
Yeah, right? That's right. Yeah.
Ukraine.
I feel like flying there. But yeah. And that is at joinsherpa.com. Joinsherpa.com.
Yeah, the link is at the bottom of that guidance page, which that's one of the main questions we get as well. And there's some unfortunate misconceptions, and I don't know if you want to get into this just yet, but just about particularly travel in and out of the States, or even through the States. The through the States one has bitten a couple people in the rear end pretty hard, because they figured they could just do a fuel stop on the way to somewhere else, and lo and behold, they couldn't get on the airplane because you can't even stop when passing through the States, at least as far as the official rules go, right?
So. No, and I know even my co-host, usually Chris Scott from Whistle Stop Cafe, he flew out to Amsterdam. He flew out at Christmas, and then he flew out a couple of weeks ago, and the same sort of thing. So going out there, if you fly direct, not an issue, but he basically had to fly through the States. So, and again, whether or not the trade secrets or whatever that you can possibly say about what you can say or what you can't say, but I do believe somewhere on these on this form, it just basically says you've been vaccinated. And so, I mean, check that off, right? Because he's probably been more vaccinated than anybody else I know, because he used to work in Colombia and a bunch of different things through the just working with the oil field, right? So
similar to the military,
So obviously that when you have two groups of people, I guess, that you look after. You looking after the pilots, or at least having discussions with the pilots, and you're also on behalf of the passengers. Of course, that is probably mostly what the people online are looking at. But I'd like to know, is there any legal stuff that you guys have been involved with in terms of going back and trying to, through the government or whatever, to say, look, this shouldn't have happened, or like, I'm not even sure what your argument has been.
Yeah, good question.
Yeah.
It's not just the pilots. It's, you got pilots, flight attendants, maintenance, air traffic control,
Yes.
airport security, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a broad spectrum. We do have legal efforts ongoing right now.
Yeah.
The law tends to be rather glacial at the best of times, and even more so right now. So we do have what'll probably morph into a class action, along with some additional claims on human rights basis, direct action, and otherwise. So that's moving along slowly, but with persistence, we'll get there for sure. We've got a meeting on that coming up next week again. So, this is usually the part where those who have been tracking with Free to Fly will have heard this mini 30-second speech a few times. But as far as solutions in this country right now, I'm a firm believer that, unfortunately, politics is very much downstream of culture, which is a bit of a cliche now, but I would say that the judiciary in this country is unfortunately downstream of politics. Meaning that, from what we've seen, the courts, as Bruce Party, a lawyer that I have a fair bit of time for, has written an article saying that the courts have chosen a side when it comes to COVID. So ergo, take it back to the start. Culture is the battleground, and until we change culture, I really don't see things turning around. That is the battleground, and until we get 1,000 or 10,000, in the words of Solzhenitsyn in his famous "Lived Not by Lies" piece, that post Gulag, that was his point to the Soviets, who were descending back into the same sort of subjugation that they've suffered for so long. Is if you get 1,000 of us together or 10,000 of us, they will not recognize our country. And we saw that with the Freedom Convoy. It did start to move the needle. And what you saw, to reinforce my point, was, and I may be unpopular for saying this, but some who had been silent, including the conservatives, suddenly found a voice once there was enough detention that it was like, hey, this is politically expedient, and that's just the nature of politics, right? You need to get elected. So all of that to say, I do feel there's a place for legal action, and that's why we're pursuing it. Because right now, what's happened, even for those workers who've gone back to work, it's akin to, you're sitting at home having a nice dinner with your family with all of your goods and belongings around you, and suddenly a gang comes in and says, vacate the home, you're on the streets, we're taking everything, right? And so you get out, and then they come back, a few months later, and they say, you can come back in your house now, and half your stuff is gone, and you're supposed to just be okay with it and carry on, right? It's like, well, I've got all this, I'm out of income. I'm out of, some people's marriages fell apart because of it. They lost all sorts of benefits, et cetera, et cetera. And we're supposed to just say, thank you, master, for giving me my job back. We can't live in a society where we don't even pursue justice. So we're going to continue doing that. I don't want to be defeatist about it, but I do think we've got to continue focus on the fact that culture is the battleground, and what that means, fortunately or unfortunately. And the reason I phrase it that way is because people get discouraged, because these impacting culture means the nitty-gritty of having direct, sometimes difficult conversations with family, neighbors, employers, church members, et cetera, et cetera. And you don't have to be unkind or rude about it, but you need to speak truth, and you need to speak truth courageously and uncomfortably at times. And unfortunately, that it takes a while. But you don't need 51% of a nation to turn it around. You need a fairly small, a proportionally small number. It's the old courage begets courage piece.
That's right.
That really, and you know it from your own background. If 100 other restaurants in your local area had stayed
open,
right,
things may have actually looked different. And that's kind of why I'm even involved in the Alberta Prosperity Project, because I do believe that there is a way to get the word out of what's been happening and how there are solutions. And basically that's why we like doing these webinars, is because we get these topics out. And so people that are viewing, you can definitely share this and make sure that people, are able to at least have the conversation about, well, I think everyone should just be able to free to fly, or, just go get jabbed and then you're free to fly. There's more to it than something that's just black and white. So that's why I like
it's
listening to these.
Yeah, it's encouraging hearing other people's stories. We've got one of the members kind of in our core group of pilots, and I'll give him a shout out. I won't say his last name, but Colin. He's got a heart of gold, and my father is incredibly outgoing, which I'm actually not myself, to the point where, as a kid, he'd be talking to everybody in the store, driving you crazy. Well, I think Colin is even more so, but he interacts with people in a way that's kind of endearing, but a little bit in their face with the mask type thing, for instance, right? Yep, Lines kind of, hey, it sure would be nice to see your smiling face. And he actually gets people to take their masks off.
Is that right? Wow.
Personally, I'm not terribly comfortable with it, but I see him and I hear him talk about it, and I think courage begets courage, right? Like,
that's right.
We should all be, and just not to hammer away at the masks here, because we've kind of done that to death. But ironically, that was the first hill to die on, as I like to say, in spite of my own beliefs contrary. But just towards the end of the mask mandate in the airports, in the last few weeks, this is an example of what I'm talking about. So I tend to go sometimes back and forth between Montreal and Toronto. So in Montreal, technically speaking, the Big Brother announcements were still coming out. Everyone must wear their masks. Well, in Montreal, they had decided, we're done with this stupidity. We're not doing it anymore. So 80% of the people just collectively said, screw you, and didn't bother.
Oh, yeah.
You flew an hour and a bit to the west. You landed in Toronto. Same Big Brother announcements. 98% of the people were wearing their masks. Now, technically, according to Transport Canada, if you knew the rules, you didn't have to. And so I wasn't bothering as a pilot. And a couple people would come up and say, thanks so much. And there was a couple other guys that weren't, but you hadn't reached that tipping point. Because I think by then the majority were kind of thinking, this is really stupid, but I don't want to be the only person, right? I don't want to be the only person. Yeah. And then one or two people, and they think, I can be whatever your threshold is, right? I could be the fourth person, or maybe the kind of person that needs to be the 50th person, but we need those previous 49 to get there. So be the number one, or be the number two, or be the number three. That's how we affect change, right?
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. And I'm assuming because you fly all over. So we had the conversation. I used to fly extensively for trade shows and through my business. And then once COVID hit, that's it. I haven't been on a commercial airline. We've flown up to like Grand Prairie and to La Crete, Bonnyville on a plane, right? But just on a little 4-seater Cessna. But I have not flown commercially. I really haven't even gone into an airport per se since then. So I don't even know what the rules are and how much has changed. What do you think? You just said that, going Montreal and Toronto, people are masking up. Are do you think anybody's actually having those conversations even on the plane? Like, have you heard anything like?
Well, just to clarify, there's no mask mandate anymore on the aircraft or in the airports. There's people that are doing it voluntarily still.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's since whenever it was. End of September, I think last year, maybe the end of October, end of September, I think that was no longer the case.
Yeah.
And I would say, stepping back a little bit, when the mandate was finally suspended, which is a word I choose carefully, I would say that came about through that same sort of collective action. It was individuals, it was political embarrassment, I think, at an international level somewhat as well, this whole ArriveCan fiasco and otherwise that eventually had that rescinded. But right now, aside from if you're unjabbed and want to go to the US, it's pretty much, I don't want to say normal because we do not live in a normal world anymore, but you can travel back and forth reasonably liberally, unless you want to go to Ukraine or Pakistan and go to the US, basically, right? So
that's right. And likewise, I know there are some places that you're allowed to travel. However, they also want you to test when you get there or before you get there, I guess, right? So again, I think that website actually does point out some of that stuff too. So
yeah, and there's a few of them out there, and so I would just encourage your viewers to do due diligence, because we get emails all the time, unfortunately, from people that are post having thrown away a whole bunch of money, and then are at the moment where they're like, wow, I thought I could go to Florida with my unjabbed family. And the answer is, well, it depends on who you're flying with. Technically, according to the rules, you cannot. There's lots of people that are getting across the land border and purchasing tickets and otherwise, which I'm sure most of your viewers are aware of. The aviation world tends to be a little bit more precise, and there's more layers of verification. So I don't want to tell anybody one way or the other what they should or shouldn't do, but I would say do your due diligence before you spend any money.
So having said that, is there any talk about opening up some of the borders like in the US?
Yeah, so I appreciate the question, because there's a lot of confusion on there, and I don't want to go on for 15 minutes about it, because I actually put together a video that's about 12 or 15 minutes long that explains it a little bit in a little bit more detail. But what's been the pattern, and it's a bit of a cruel pattern, is there's all sorts of there's various layers. So the air travel one is the CDC order that basically binds you there. And then the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, is the one that keeps you from going across the land border. Now, what's happened at least twice, and is set to happen again in April, is there's a TSA security directive. And this is the TSA security directive is the guidance for the airlines in how to implement the CDC order. So it says to the airlines, if you have a passenger that is trying to travel from A to B across the border, here's what you need to do to verify their information. And there's a notional expiry date. I think it's April 3rd or 8th or 11th, somewhere in there. And it happened again in January. So a host of people understandably think, yes, finally I can go to the States. And they're all waiting for this date to come. And guess what happens? They just kick it down the road another 3-4 months, because nothing has changed, because the CDC order is still in place. And that comes essentially from Biden's proclamation. So if you go, again, I don't want to go on and on about it. That single page on our website, I tried to distill it as best I could. And you can read through all of the stuff if you were really having a hard time sleeping at night or something. You can read through the individual orders and otherwise. But don't be fooled, I guess, by some of these dates. There's so much information, and it's hard to stay on top of. It's the guidance one, just the next tab over there.
This one here?
So if you scroll down, it shows USA. It's got links to the different stuff. It explains what I just did. Then it says, in practice, here's what's actually happening. And then some things you can do to take action, which we try to be focused on as well. And then in Canada, because there's people outside the country that still think that they can't get in, which is actually not the case anymore. And then that link you mentioned right at the very bottom there.
Exactly. So that's where that link is to that site right there. Perfect. Great. And so obviously we're talking about planes here, but I'm assuming that there's probably similar stuff in terms of passengers and employees for trains, trucks, automobiles, anything that need buses, anything like that. Are you guys in contact with any of them to find out what's happening with legislation there? Or?
Well, we've been in contact with some of the other federally mandated employees, the posties, the government workers, Purelator. There's a few of us that have been in touch back and forth, just swapping ideas. Not quite as much now with the federal mandate suspended at this point. Although, I was just on another interview with some. There's some firefighters that flat out lost their jobs in Alberta and never got back. And so I think that's worth pointing out as well. And it's the same within the aviation industry. I'm blessed to be back at work right now, but there's others who are not. And I try to always do my best to give a shout out to these courageous men and women who continue to stand by their principles, because it's certainly a grind. So as far as the other industries, I'm not as up to speed on the nuances, I guess, of where they're at. There's never enough hours in the day just to deal with the aviation piece, but we're certainly interested and happy to collaborate with as many people as we can just to try and gain some traction.
Do you know if there's pilots that obviously, and this is more of a general question, I guess. If there's pilots that are unvaccinated, I guess they can't fly down legally down to the U.S. as well. So, do you know if your company or other companies kind of make arrangements so that maybe you fly more in Canada, as an example?
Well, that's a fascinating question, and it's like you're just lobbing me a softball to go ahead and hammer away at. So here's the insanity of the world we live in: is nope, that's not the case. As a matter of fact, I'll be in the U.S. tomorrow, and I'm perfectly safe to be in the U.S. as long as I have my magical pilot superpower exemption, right? So, so there's an exemption that's buried deeply on one of those pages in the CDC guidance that exempts flight crew for being in the States. But as soon as I come home and put on my jeans and a sweatshirt, then I can no longer technically enter the U.S. So that's kind of how it works. It's this complete decoupling of common sense from policy. Now, clearly, I believe we should all be moving about freely. But here we have a policy where ostensibly it's not permitted due to safety, but expediency trumps everything, right? At least in this case. So in order to keep things moving, that's kind of the road they've gone down. So we're hopeful we can get to a place here sooner than later. You know, Biden's mentioned this May 11th thing. We've been lobbying with a bunch of congressmen and senators in the States to try and get this whole mess sorted out. Talked to some phenomenal individuals down there who are working hard. There is a bill, HR 185, which is sitting in the Senate right now. It hasn't necessarily stalled there, but they're sorting through sponsorship, trying to get it through the Senate. So in the process of that, there's a lot of people, just to our previous point, that are thinking May 11th, thank goodness everything's going back to normal. And unfortunately, that's not really the case. They're saying there's no guarantee at all that this will change, even given his picking of a random date in May to make everything okay again, right? So we're hopeful that things can happen before then. But yeah, that's the bill there.
Yeah, it's interesting that, because you think, you know, governments and countries, they trump everything. They mandate, and that's just the way it is. But even with us, even in Alberta, even in Canada, so of course I was a restaurant owner, and we shut down. And we shut down prior to vaccine policy coming in. However, I also am an entertainer, and so a musician. I host karaoke, I DJ, I do all that. So I was still allowed to work at restaurants and bars during that time, even though I'm not. And and even with that, a lot of the employees that I talked to were also not vaccinated, and yet they were able to work there. So really, it just came down to, as we all know, this was about control. So that you, if you were a good doobie and you got your vax, you were able to go into a restaurant, and congratulations, you're able to do that. But they cannot, in Canada, basically deny you the right to work. So if you were working at a restaurant, at that point you couldn't be fired in order to do that, right? So that's kind of where we were. And so interesting that you're able to fly down to the States, because essentially they can't take that job away from you per se, right? Although they did, I guess, at the beginning of all this.
Yeah, well, we were out of work from essentially October to August or September of 2022. And the threat was termination initially in May, and then they kicked the termination back to November 1st of 2022. And then once the mandate was suspended, then the bulk of people, but not all, came back at that point.
So here's another. I mean, I'm pretty sure questions are going to come up, and I had a bunch of notes that obviously I wanted to find out about that. We're seeing stuff like this on the news.
Let me guess what you're going to put up there.
I'm pretty sure you know what I'm going to put on. So here was a tweet today. I'm being notified by passengers on a Southwest flight departing Las Vegas that the captain became incapacitated soon after takeoff this morning. He was removed from the flight deck and replaced by a non-Southwest pilot who was commuting on that flight. This is now the 5th pilot incapacitation incapacitation that I'm aware of in the past 2 weeks. I will post more info. We see a lot more of that. And I even did just a quick Google search of pilot collapsing, and there's pages and pages of stuff going on. So do you want to make any comments on that?
Yeah, it's a bit of a longer conversation than everybody might have a stomach for. I know Josh, actually just texting with him today. We brokered a coalition back spring of last year specifically for this reason, to highlight our concerns about pilot health and safety with the Freedom Flyers in the States, along with several groups in Europe, and then the Australian Freedom Flyers as well. So we're in contact regularly. We have a group chat like everybody has for everything else these days, and we share information and try and stay on top of this stuff. And so we've been very vocal with it. It's worth stepping back just very briefly to lay the groundwork. So when this mandate came out, we had a document put together by a bunch of doctors and scientists that when we sat down with them, they said of any profession in this country, pilots are the ones we're most concerned about, because there's cardiovascular concerns. You sit on your rear end for hours and hours at a time. You're spending hours at a time, a month in thin air, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a 13, 14-page document that was put together, well-sourced. The Canadian COVID Care Alliance, Steve Pelican, Byron Brattle, put it together after we sat down and had a Zoom call with them. So that was provided to the two largest pilot unions in the country, along with a couple major airlines. And here we are, what it would be now, a year and a half, 2 years later, probably 10 emails later, and it's been complete silence, really. So we've raised our concerns over this from day one. There's a host of us that were okay with ending our decades-long career to stand against it because we were concerned. So clearly, I am very vested in speaking to the elevated risk. Now, at the same time, I think we've got to be careful and we've got to be nuanced with how we address this. Pilot incapacitation has been a thing since flying started.
Oh, okay.
It can be anything from food poisoning to low blood pressure to the worst case, heart attack.
Just being tired, right? If you're running ragged, or
typically that wouldn't completely incapacitate you, I would hope, but this has been a thing, and I've analyzed some of the data, and I won't get into to a ton of that, but it's a concern. But at the same time, if we're weaponizing fear in the process here and summoning imagery, as has been the case with one individual in the FAA, former FAA employee in the States, was talking about people in apartments and houses and beaches should be concerned about airplanes plummeting from the sky, I would say you're just another version of CNN and the New York Times at this point. Because if you're an aviation professional, and this is my concern, Carrie, what we're not trying to do here, certainly not what I'm not interested in, is getting accolades, likes, shares, and followers on like-minded media. That's not my goal. I love these people dearly, and they're what has carried me through these past few years. But what I'm really interested in is the people that don't think like me. And so that's what we've really got to aim to target. And so if I start summoning imagery of planes plummeting to the sky, every other professional pilot in this country will call me a buffoon, and rightly so.
You're right.
Because when you have a pilot incapacitation, and I'll just talk through it very briefly here, because I think it's important, because we get people contacting us all the time saying, should I ever fly in an airplane again? And I would say, well, Klaus Schwab doesn't want you to, so what are we doing here, right? We don't want people to be living in fear. We want them to continue going to see Grandma in Saskatoon and otherwise. So if I'm flying from Vancouver to Toronto, and my first officer keels over, I'm instantly very concerned about him. If he's flying the aircraft at the time, typically it's on autopilot. So I will assume control, which is as much as pushing a button, essentially. I will maintain safety of flight by securing him, getting his seat moved back, getting him secured. If there is another pilot that's traveling, we'll try and swap him out. If not, we'll secure him. And then the goal is to get the aircraft on the ground for his health and safety and the rest of the crew or the rest of the aircraft. Now, having said that, there's elevated risk because a diversion with an aircraft is a high workload event for a two-man, two-woman crew. So now when you're doing it single pilot, there's all sorts of additional stress and opportunity to miss things. So make no mistake, I'm not minimizing the risk here.
Yeah.
But I don't want people traveling worrying that they're going to crash, that there's a high probability of it. I mean, we train for engine failures in aircraft. We don't train for dual engine failures. The odds of both pilots expiring in flight due to a jab injury is astronomically low.
Yeah.
So again, I say it's like dealing with a horrific snowstorm.
Yeah.
You manage the risk, right? And so we're dealing with a higher risk scenario. If you're in a snowstorm, you put snow tires on. You drive a little bit slower. What I would say is that Transport Canada, in this case, and I could go on about this for a very long time, they're the ones that should be putting the proverbial snow tires on for aviation, and they have been absent as a safety regulator since 2020, as far as I'm concerned, and that continues to this day. And I can speak to why I'm somewhat passionate and probably unpopular with Transport Canada, I guess, because of it. But I think the traveling public needs to understand what they can do to help and who they should be targeting. And Transport Canada is certainly one of them when it comes to this jab injury thing, because they did no efficacy or safety trials from the get-go. Those of us that were asking questions, they just stopped answering the questions, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Are pilots supposed to go in for like a yearly physical or anything like that?
Supposed to. Yeah.
Supposed to? Okay. And what's been happening with that? I'm assuming everybody does, and they get signed off, and then they can go and fly. I'm just kind of using the same analogy that I know about train engineers and
right.
Driving a bus. Right?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because every other nation in the world, that's what the pilots are doing. But here in Canada, back in 2020, just to step back. So when COVID first hit, it's a standard, it's the same thing we all say. Well, none of us knew what was going on, so we were pretty forgiving of strange policy. Yeah. So initially it was, well, you can just mail it in, basically. Have your wife sign a piece of paper and say that you're healthy and you're good to go. Yeah. So they extended the medicals essentially to start out with. Then, as we moved into 2021, they said, well, we're going to do telemedicals now. So you can do 2 telemedicals. So instead of coming in annually, you can do 2 telemedicals. And then you just have to show up in person for your 3rd one. So what that means is you've now got guys possibly in their 40s, 50s, even 60s, not doing an ECG, for instance, for 36 months. This was something that for decades was an absolute requirement, the same as simulators and otherwise, because it's an issue of safety. And Transport Canada said, no, that's fine. Even up until the last few months of last year. And there's been a lot of noise made, in part because Tucker Carlson and Steve Kirsch have been focusing on it in the States. They've widened the parameter for pilot EKGs in the States. Yeah. And with my Canadian voice, I say, well, hang on a second. We're doing it even worse up here, because we're just not even going to bother doing EKGs anymore. That's the shocking reality in Canada. And this is during a time, if you look at late 2022 or into March of this year was when that was supposed to expire, the country was more or less open, aside from some outliers, right? You could go wherever you wanted without a mask. So as a pilot, I could crowd myself into a subway car and go downtown Toronto, eat a burger in a pub, and then sit with 20,000 people at a hockey game, as I should.
That's right.
Game. Yeah. But Transport Canada said, COVID, social distancing, you just phone in your medical. That's fine. You don't have to actually show up in person. So we've been pretty vocal, tried to get in touch with politicians who sadly, it seems that if it smells a little bit of the whole jab issue, they don't really want to touch it. And the pushback from the one I talked to was, well, this expires in March. Well, lo and behold, Kerry, March 1st of this year, Transport Canada shockingly and egregiously extended this asinine, unsafe policy to 2025. So in Canada, again, we are alone globally, as far as I know. I've checked in with all of our aviation group. We're the only nation in the world I know of that is allowing pilots to go 36 months without EKGs, without in-person medicals, or otherwise. And I've spent hours on the phone just in my role. Some of our pilots are suffering post-jab injuries. They're okay to talk to me. They're not really keen to raise their hand and point out what they're dealing with, because they took the shot to save their job. And if we lose our medical, we essentially lose our job.
Yeah.
So there's guys out that are suffering injuries. So, some of them are minor, but some of them are more concerning, as most of us have friends and neighbors and otherwise that are dealing with issues from these stupid things as well.
Yeah.
So now we're in a situation where we've got Transport Canada doctors, because I've asked the question. I said, well, what do you think of this? They say, well, because the new exemption, the reason was no longer COVID, because that would be even a little bit too far for Mr. Algabra. It was flexibility. Since when did flexibility trump safety?
Yeah.
And this is why I say they've abdicated their role, right? And so I've said to one of his traffic transport doctors, what do you think? Well, it's convenient for those who are healthy. And I said, well, how do you know they're healthy? And there wasn't really much of an answer. I'm like, do we allow our pilots just to phone and say, I'm an awesome pilot, I'm really good at my job, I'm competent, I don't need to do simulator? We don't allow that. I have to go in the simulator every 4 to 6 months, typically, to prove that I can do my job properly, because it's an issue of safety, right?
Yeah.
So this is the situation that we're in at this point. And the reason I'm kind of hammering on this the last few weeks is because I feel amongst the public, the like-minded public, there's a lot of frustration, even over what you just posted, Kerry, with seeing these issues with pilots.
Yeah.
But what can the average person sitting at their computer, like, another issue with a pilot, what am I supposed to do, right? Other than be outraged, because outrage just gets your blood pressure up. Well, here's what you can do. Contact Transport Canada, contact the airlines, ask them why they're still okay with doing this, because so far it seems they're okay with it.
Yeah.
Contact your MP. Take action as best you can, right? So this is an opportunity to do that, because when we're dealing with this crew incapacitation issue, here's the quandary. The final backstop to tracking down the people that are really injured is what? Medicals.
Yeah, that's right.
And what are we doing with the medicals? We're phoning it in. You only have to show up once every 3 years. Yeah. And the answer is, well, hey, if you want to come in, go ahead. And I'm like, well, it's a 4-hour round trip for me to go to the doctor. Like most middle-aged men, I got 100 things I'd rather do. And, unless it's really bad, I'm probably not going to go. Yeah. And sadly, only 2 weeks after that exemption was put in place again, the Transportation Safety Board, which is an independent body, put out an accident report from an airline transport pilot, rated pilot. So he was a pilot with an airline. He sadly crashed in a private flight, private aircraft back in October of 21. Mm-hmm. And what was highlighted in this was the fact that year he had simply attested his health. And so what was the recommendation out of this, and I'll quote it directly just so I don't butcher it here. The TSB recommends Transport Canada establish routine review and improvement for civil aviation medical examiner guidelines. And that's about as pointed as you're going to get with two quasi-governmental institutes poking the fingers at each other. They're essentially saying this needs to be tightened up a little bit. So it's a serious issue. Very, very long monologue on my part. Sorry, but
no, that was great. I'll bet you 90% of the viewers had no idea that that it was basically delayed or the basically telemedical and not actually going to see a doctor directly. Right. When I actually heard about that, that to me was an eye opener. Right. And then again, you get concerned about not only the pilot's safety or pilot's health, but anybody that's flying safety as well. And obviously we do not want to sound that alarm, because I don't think it's an issue at all if you've got two pilots in there.
Well, it is. And I want to be careful not to go too far to the other extreme, because like I said, it is. If you have to do a diversion as a pilot, it's a giant pain in the rear at best, and it's a very high workload event. And when you're doing it by yourself, particularly if you've got bad weather, or let's say you're typically if you're going across the ocean, you're going to have an extra pilot. But sometimes if it's a shorter leg, there may only be two of you. Well, now you're oceanic. You're going to be sitting there for an hour. Trying to deal with a guy or girl who may be in very bad circumstance or otherwise. So, I mean, some of these things are happening to flight attendants as well as we're seeing with the general public additionally, right? And then that creates issues safety related in the cabin as well, because now you're down one flight attendant in the event of emergency or otherwise. So it is a very serious event or issue, and we've got to stay on top of it.
Yeah. Did you want to we can jump into some questions, I know, because we've got a few things, but do you want to mention anything that you think people should know more than what we've talked about already?
No, I know you and I talked about a couple other things, but I've kind of hammered away at Transport Canada a fair bit here. I mean, this goes back to 2020 and then them just flat out pulling stuff off the internet that was inconvenient and otherwise. But you can scroll through our Twitter feed if you like. And feel free to follow us on Twitter and all that other stuff. I'm supposed to say.
Just looking free to fly, right? Free to fly. So here's a question: is their group as like Free to Fly working in the U.S. and are they working with you and having success on the obviously on getting stuff through like Bill HR 185? Do you know of anybody?
Yeah. Right. So thanks for the question, Sheila. So that's Josh Yoder. He's the president of the U.S. Freedom Flyers, the gentleman that I was speaking of. So he heads up their group in the States. We're back and forth regularly, mainly these days about the pilot health and safety issue. I haven't talked to him a whole lot about HR 185. The reality, even when we were lobbying with these American congressmen and otherwise, is unfortunately the nature of political expediency is there's not a ton to be gained for these politicians within their own ridings to open up the northern border, right? Yeah. But what I like to point out is, hey, you're alone amongst Angola, Pakistan, and otherwise, and you seem very focused on the northern border while your southern border is rather porous.
That's right.
Which they don't tend to disagree with. So the Freedom Flyers hasn't really been what they've been focused on, in part because there's never enough hours in a day. Yeah. They have had some legal things going on. There's been a couple setbacks. I'm not tracking really closely what they're doing lately from a constitutional standpoint, but most of their guys and gals weren't put out of work for any long period of time. So it was a little bit of a different scenario, in part because there was that tipping point that said, you're not coming near me with that thing. And then the airlines kind of looked at the numbers and thought, we can't fly airplanes when there's that many folks that aren't going to take it. So they carried on. Yeah. A plug for collective action once more.
Okay. There's a few questions that come up like this, where if you look back in the Wayback Machine, which is kind of the way that Google records stuff, from May 2021, there were Transport Canada landing page saying that they do not recognize the altered mRNA as treatment, as it was only approved under emergency use authorization. If Greg Hill feels that he could use that for the lawsuit, please send me a PM. I don't know if that you've probably heard stuff like this, or maybe.
This is exactly what we talked about before. So they didn't specifically mention the mRNA piece, but what they did, if you can just pull that tweet up, Carrie, because that's exactly what she's referring to.
This one here, okay, give me a second. I just have to.
So I was back and forth with one of the Transport Canada doctors asking these questions, along with one or two other people, saying, well, you say we're not supposed to. It didn't specifically refer to the mRNA. What it referred to was, I'm just trying to pull it up here myself. Places no restrictions on limitations. So there, you've got it. So that line there, I don't need to read it to you. So this was what was on there. So the Wayback Machine is very handy. It's good to see your viewers are aware of it, because we found all sorts of stuff. We're actually going to be putting something out that's quite shocking over the next couple days. So stay tuned. Wow. Not necessarily related to transport, but the Wayback Machine plays into it. So this is what it said before. So we said, hey, hang on a second. This is only approved under interim order, a little bit different than the EMA in the States. Yeah. And if you read the interim order, it essentially was what we in the military used to call pencil whipping. Like, we'll just start using this and we'll figure out the details and try and make it okay after the fact. Yeah. So after we asked these questions, literally, I think it was 6 days later or 7 days later, you can pull up what the website looked like afterwards. Just the next one down there. This one here. Yeah. They just flat out took that page, and that statement had been on there for, it's got to be 10 plus years. And if you look at the heat map, those that use Wayback Machine, you'll be familiar with the heat map. It got very busy around, I think it was the 22nd of July. Yeah. So can we use that legally? No, not really. It's vague enough. There's a lot of people that have pointed to some of the stuff in the FAA as far as their vaccination policies. It's a little bit different up here in Canada. Yeah. If you look at our AIM, which is our guidance for a lot of this stuff, it's pretty vague. And what I've learned about the law is it better be ironclad, or it's very difficult to get any traction nowadays. So I appreciate bringing up the point, though, because it is quite shocking what's happened online.
I'm going to ask this question anyways, because it's a question that people will often ask us out of the blue, out of completely unrelated anyways.
Let me guess. I was going to say chemtrails. I was going to say it before you pulled it up there.
Oh, good job. So,
yeah.
Any
well,
comment?
weather modification is definitely a thing. I get this question so often that I've actually got a 2-page document that I'm happy to send to people to explain what contrails are versus chemtrails, explain why the ability to hide this from everything from the entire pilot population to air traffic control and on and on. I'm not discounting weather modification. That happens, but it doesn't happen up in the high 20s, 30,000 feet, which is where we tend to fly. So it's a rather long and nuanced answer. I mean, some of it's the scientific stuff as far as contrails go, but there's no chemtrail switch in any aircraft that I've flown. I mean, just as an example, people talk about, well, could they possibly hide it? You guys wouldn't be aware. Well, the instrumentation is so refined at this point that when you start to get nuances, even in fuel type,
and weight and
weight, and that's a big deal, right? Like on morning flights, airlines typically don't load ice for drinks to save, because every pound you carry additional it burns more fuel, and the airlines are obsessive about fuel burn.
Yeah.
So they'd have to be heavily compensated in order to carry around something additional, and the airlines are not in the habits of giving away much at all, as the traveling public knows. So anyway, if somebody's interested, feel free to email us, and I'd be happy to send that. It's like I said, I'm not trying to be disingenuous or otherwise. It deserves a full answer, and it's like a 2-page answer. So
and definitely will. While I'm scrolling through here, we'll be plugging your Free to Fly website. And is there any other stuff on the website that might be of interest to people?
Well, like I said, a shout out to Patrick, our young, I think he's 22.
Yeah.
He was a phenomenal gentleman who also lost his flying training and his university training. He kindly volunteered to help us. So he's actually back doing his flying training. He's also started a computer business. So he volunteers doing our website. So he's in the process of completely revamping it to simplify it somewhat, because it's a little bit busy in my mind right now.
Yeah.
But the news link gives you kind of recent things we put out, interviews, podcasts, etc. And then the resource hub is where you're going to find so there's those action contacts there. That's useful if you want to get a hold of Transport Canada and otherwise, then the guidance that you talked about, and it kind of goes on and on. The resource hub kind of centralizes some of that stuff a little bit better as far as.
Looks like you've done a couple of videos otherwise too, so that those are on there as well with the Iron Will report.
Yeah. There's all sorts of stuff going on depending on what's happening from day to day, right? So
that's right.
We'll try and simplify it a little bit.
And how to contact you? There's a page right there. Contact us. And does that go to you, or do you have anybody that is looking after this?
I see all of that, but a shout out to Trisha, who is our admin helper, a kind woman from out in BC, who just stepped up and has been relentless in her ability to dig into really boring things that I often don't have time for or don't want to do. So she tends to keep an eye on the inbox and leaves the emails for me to check in with as well. But
and I also see there's some merch, I guess, that we could buy.
So the luggage tags are pretty cool, actually. I've got one, and actually the guy I was flying with today says, "What's free to fly?" So I said, well, it's a bit of a long story. And out of that comes some interesting conversations. So typically what we find, people ask, how's it been coming back to work? Like, was it the average guys? 98% of it, a lot of guys say, man, I have so much respect. I wish I would have done the same. I didn't want to get the shot. The few that maybe are not supportive usually say, oh, did you see the Leafs game or something? Really, they just don't tend to talk about it. They just leave it alone. So the luggage tags are a good conversation starter if you happen to be traveling. We just ask for a $10 donation, but if you can't afford that, then just send us a note. our good pilot that's spearheading that, Chris, we'll get them out to you.
That's awesome. I know we even through the Alberta Prosperity Project, and actually I should have called this page up here, the Alberta Prosperity Project store, and I'm going to do that. It's kind of the same thing. We if you're wearing an APP hat as an example, and you're in the grocery store, and people will say, "So what is APP? What's it about?" And that's a good way to get into a conversation with people that you probably wouldn't normally be talking with, right? So, and then kind of educate them and tell them what's happening, and again, people think that the mandates are all gone, and I've also run into the situation where somebody was asking about. Are jobs still available, or like what is there here's one. Is there a big shortage of pilots due to the mandate? Did you notice that? Like, is that you were brought back?
That's kind of two questions. Is there a big shortage of pilots? Question mark. I can answer that one. And is there a big shortage of pilots due to the mandates? Due to the mandates, no. Unfortunately, because of what I was alluding to in the States, there was enough pilots down there that said, "Don't come near me with that thing," and they meant it. Yeah. And they kept flying airplanes. And I don't say this disparagingly, but we had a fairly good-sized group, and this was the case across almost every industry in Canada that were opposed to it. And it was heartbreaking to watch people wrestle through that. Literally, I was on the phone with people in tears, struggling with like, how do I pay my mortgage? How do I look after my family? So it dwindled to an unfortunately small group, to the point where the company's attitude was, that's a lot of experience. And I would say the aviation industry as a whole took a beating experience-wise because of it, but it wasn't enough to cripple them. It was acceptable attrition, put it that way. Mm-hmm. So we saw a great big mess last summer. People thought that was maybe due to the vax mandate. Maybe in some of what we call under the wing, the baggage handler security, and otherwise maybe their numbers were a little bit higher. I don't have exact numbers. I'm more familiar with the pilot, although we have those numbers across our supporter group. Yeah. But the industry had ostensibly been sitting on the couch eating Cheetos basically for a year and a half, and then all of a sudden it was like, "Hey, time to run a marathon," and it went really, really badly. And throw in ArriveCAN, which ground customs hauls to a halt. Yeah. And again, here's another plug for collective action. If you simply had 15% of every flight with 200 or 300 people on it, walk up and say, "Go ahead and write your little green ticket. I'll be standing here waiting with all these people behind me," it would have been over with quite quickly.
You're right. Yeah, absolutely.
But it's a difficult thing to ask of people. And so again, I don't say that condescendingly. I get it. When you're in the customs hall and some guy with a flak vest on is giving you the grilling you and doing the power trip thing, it's very, very difficult to take a stand. So
just a comment. Truly, the majority rules if only everyone stands up for common sense and medical privacy. And you know what? Even if there was enough of a small fringe minority that were able to stand up too, that probably would have stopped, because like you said, if there was 150 people on a plane and 15 of those people said, write me up a ticket, that is not the majority, but it's enough to cause a change, right? So here's another comment, and we'll make a comment on this too. So kudos to the pilots who stood their, pardon the pun, ground in not getting the jab and had lost their jobs as a result. They'll be the ones that will be filling in for those who become unable to fly and incapacitated. So I'd like to just say it's not everyone that gets jabbed gets any issues. Like right now, the stats that we've looked at, just in out of everybody, you look at the VAERS reports, you look at some of the other reporting, it is less than 5%, right? So it's not like all the pilots will become unable to fly, just so you know. You want to make any comment on that?
No, the reason it's focused on, and this goes back to really what we've tried to, when Matt Sattler, my good friend and co-director, when we stood up Free to Fly, what we were trying to summon was the pilot archetype, essentially, right? Think Sully Sullenberg on the Hudson, right? So when crap is hitting the fan, we're not cowering in a corner sucking our thumb. We're standing up straight with our shoulders back, to summon Jordan Peterson. We're calmly addressing the crisis, and we're trying to be the voice of sanity and the adults in the room. And so that's how we're trying to approach this issue as well, is to address the fact that, yes, there is elevated risk. And some of these people are free to fly supporters, members, etc. And my heart goes out to them. Some of them are not flying right now because they took the shot and they've ended up with issues. So, we're not sitting on the sidelines thinking that we're gonna benefit because of it. The reality is, to step back to a question that I didn't answer, is there's a serious shortage of pilots in Canada and globally. Some of the airlines in this country are coming up on contract negotiations, so the airlines will tell you right now there is no pilot shortage. But anybody who knows anything about the industry knows that there is a very serious shortage of not just numbers, but I would say more problematically, experience. When I started flying, I was 38. I had thousands of hours coming out of the military, and the pilots showing up now, a lot of them are in their early 20s. They're very competent professionals, but they don't have a ton of experience. So I'm not being disparaging to them. I'm just saying, doing something, going through 3 or 4 seasons of winter is different than going through 25 or 30 seasons of winter and then garnering that experience over time, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So there is a shortage. Who knows what the aviation industry looks like in the next 5 to 10 years? I would say the globalist cabal has it in their right in their crosshairs. They're looking at grinding us into 15-minute cities and otherwise. So, that's a whole separate topic.
Yeah. And even just in terms of doctors, there seems to be a shortage of doctors, of any medical professionals. And again, you need that experience. You can't just come out of medical school and just start practicing, like doing major surgeries. As far as I know, there's got to be that certain amount, right? I've got a daughter that's going in for optometry, and it's the same thing. She's got certain things that she needs to get done every year before she'll actually be able to go out and actually practice that, right? And do laser eye surgery or whatever, right? So yeah. Well, there you go. So I'll leave this open for another minute or two if anybody else wants to ask some other questions. And in the meantime, I just want to go back and take a look at this this site again. So again, if somebody's interested in flying somewhere, this is a great tool that that you should be able to look at. And here you can see. So if I'm in Canada and not vaccinated, I got 14 places I can just travel to. I've got 46 if I test and travel, and then test and quarantine as well. Entry is restricted and unknown. So of course, these are this is a great tool. I'm going to sit on this and see where I can fly in the next month, because I do need to. I need a vacation.
Yeah, well, and people will invariably send us an email to clarify this. So let me just maybe divert some of those right off the bat.
Yeah,
we're aware that many are having success in getting across the land border, and this is typically what I tell people is I've heard that you can get across the land border because it generally comes down to one individual, and it would seem that the majority of them are either over it or not in favor of it.
Yeah.
And then once you get across, once you're into the States, you can travel unfettered across the U.S. like a normal free human being.
Yeah.
And I would recommend that that's probably the best route to go about, because otherwise maybe you can do it out of Canada, but after you've dropped a couple $1,000s on a plane ticket, it kind of sucks to find that they've gone ahead and checked all your documents, and lo and behold, you can't go anywhere, right?
I know there's a lot of places that are just like across the border. So coming from Winnipeg, it was either Grand Forks or Fargo. You could drive down there and then fly from somewhere there. In Calgary, we of course have Kalispell, and even in BC, of course, you could probably just go down to Seattle or something like that, and from there. So there are definitely options. And our buddy Wayne here, how do you get to that page? I believe it is just Sherpa.com. It's
I don't know if there's another one on there, but if it's the last link on that guidance page as well. So yeah, give it a try.
Hopefully this doesn't show up some weird site. No, it's Acme.
Oh, something happened there when you clicked on it, but The folks at Sherpa will be very happy with the extra hits they're getting tonight.
Absolutely, yeah.
They should be going via the Free to Fly page, really, though. Not that we get anything for it, but it's the last link on that the guidance page. So
yeah, so go to Free to Fly and then go to
resources hub in the top left there.
Oh, this one here, resources hub, and then
guidance for Canadians, unjabbed travel.
There it is, right there.
And declare your courage. I'll put a plug in for that. I don't need to go to it right now, but that's something that I've really wrestled with how we get out of this mess we find ourselves in, and this declare your courage piece that's on there as well. I'd encourage people to look at, because in my view, that's really how we get out of this mess, is by individuals. We've talked a lot about this last 2 or 3 years. We've talked about freedom. But we haven't talked a lot about the responsibility side of it. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who I think I've already mentioned once, in 1978, once he was back in the States, he was asked to speak at a Harvard commencement speech. And I expect he was very unpopular for the speech he gave. It's well worth looking up. But he brilliantly summarized in 3 or 4 paragraphs that exact reality, that we have lost our way as a nation, in my view, because we've lost touch with God, but also because we've lost sight of the responsibility and accountability that is the flip side of freedom. And until we seize on that and we courageously declare our courage in individual private moments, and in bigger ones, right up to losing our jobs, our homes, and otherwise, our children and grandchildren will be living in a very dark country unless we grasp that reality.
Yeah, well said there, Greg. From Wendy here, I think it's so sad for people like me that have family and 2 new great-grandchildren born in the States that I have never met. Government have too much control over my life on both sides of the border. Yeah, it's for some of us, you might even say a small fringe minority, can be held prisoner even within our own country. Now, that's not to say we can't go anywhere, as that website showed us, but and again, I used to travel extensively, usually down to the States, go down to San Francisco, Seattle, Vegas, Chicago, New York, and so I have not been there since the beginning of COVID. So hopefully soon.
Yeah, well, and to Wendy and to yourself and anybody else, honestly, life's too short. Sometimes we've got to summon our courage, as a friend of mine used to say, and do things like find our way across the border and see our family, our grandkids, etc. You know, my parents are in their 70s, and you'd hate to be thinking, wow, I didn't see them before something terrible happened, right? So this is why I say these are God-given freedoms. God gave us responsibilities, whether that's to our family, to our church, etc. And he gave us those freedoms in order that we carry out our responsibilities. And so the state doesn't take them away. I will continue to act as a free being, because that's where these freedoms come from. And the consequences be damned, really. And I don't mean that as foul language. I mean it literally, that the consequences be what they may. This is how we get out of this, is living courageously and freely.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we like doing on these webinars, of course, is to bring it and tie it back together with, what would an APP type of situation do, and how can we make change? And so obviously we're talking about sovereignty in Alberta, even possibly an independent Alberta. And from my understanding, a lot of these rules are brought through the federal government, through Transport Canada. So my question to you is, if Alberta was its own sovereign nation or had its own jurisdiction, I think during COVID, I probably should have been able to hop on a plane and fly from Calgary to Grand Prairie, right? But according to government regulations federally, Transport Canada said, no, I can't hop on that plane.
Right. Yes, you are correct. We had people reaching out to us and saying, you guys should find a bunch of unjabbed people and start an airline. And to which I said, I would absolutely love doing that, but there are few industries in this country or in any country that are as fraught with red tape and control as aviation. And that's exactly what you're speaking of, right? So even when you're within your own province. It's a federally regulated industry, which is why we were out of work for the year.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's if there's some way that it can be shifted to the provincial, then yeah, you'd have more control over it. But yeah, that's a question that's probably more left to your expertise and knowledge than mine.
Yeah, and I know like trains and originally when we had Greyhound and we had even couriers, they all seem to be some sort of jurisdiction with some federal regulation. And again, if it
whatever happened to Greyhound anyway?
I'm assuming,
Stop?
Yeah, they don't exist anymore. I know here in Alberta we have Red Arrow for sure that goes between Calgary and Edmonton. There's probably a few other ones. And but yeah, like if I wanted to travel on a bus from Medicine Hat to Grand Prairie, I guess I would really have to look into it because I haven't traveled on a bus that far, so I don't know.
But I remember sitting on smoke-laden Greyhounds as a kid. That dates me a little bit, but
and I actually took a Greyhound from Winnipeg to Calgary back when I'm not even sure how old I was, probably 14 or 16. To come out and visit my aunt and uncle who had just moved out here a couple of years before. And but yeah, I don't even know if you can do that. I don't know if anybody knows that could reply back, but anyway, so this was great. This was great information. I think again, if people can share this and get some conversations happening about the state of what we are in terms of travel and flying and working. Right, because that's the other thing too, is that it was the pilots and yeah, I believe you called them airplane professionals, or what was
aviation professionals? Yeah, that's so right. It's across the industry. Yeah,
that's right. So anything like that, and I know I even have a neighbor who's a mechanic, and I know he was off for a few months. Now I don't know his situation. We've never really brought it up.
Well, they were mandated exactly the same. So shout out to like I said, every aviation professional. I just met up with one of our supporters at Toronto Pearson. Fantastic maintenance engineer. Yeah, he was out of work for as long as I was. So these same courageous men and women across the industry that stood the ground. So
and I think he was even off work because they didn't have as many planes in the air. Right? If
that could be as well.
Passengers and even in terms of cargo. Now, granted, I would almost say probably cargo blew up.
It was busy.
Figuratively, much busier because now everybody's buying stuff online. It was almost like they were to do that.
Yeah, it was the hero to zero thing too. We had guys that were flying PPE in and out of China.
Oh yes.
And then fast forward 8 to 10 months later, sorry, on the street with you because you won't take the jab. And like, hey, I was perfectly safe to go back and forth to China and then go home, quarantine, etc. But suddenly I'm not safe to be even like when we returned all of our gear, our iPads and our passes and everything else, we weren't allowed in the building to return them. We had to FedEx them or leave them at the curb, right? So
I heard that.
Yeah.
Drop it off at the main lobby or at the front doors.
Yeah. So hey, I promised Trisha, our stellar admin, that I would put a plug in to say we do put a fair bit on social media. I'm not a big fan of social media. I wasn't on anything until Free to Fly, and now we do that just because it's sort of a necessary evil. But we do put out a fair bit of information, including stuff on these issues that you're seeing pop up. So feel free to follow us we're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and locals. I promised her I would say that, so there you go, Trisha. I got it out finally. I'm not a very good salesman.
That's awesome. Yeah, we will
donate on our website as well, which I never say. Right.
Well, there you go. Yeah. No, that's awesome. And so with that, I'm going to say thank you very much, Greg, for your time and for advocating for freedom. I mean, it was great having a conversation with you, and I know we definitely see eye to eye on most things, and especially for the people that have now watched for the hour and 15 minutes. Thank you so much for doing that. And we do these APP webinars every Wednesday with new speakers. And of course, we have new information and we try and keep things relevant. There's next week, we have Corey Morgan who you may know from being a reporter and a columnist on the Western Standard. An interesting little bit of tidbit there. I didn't know, but he was actually one of the founders of the Alberta Independence Party in 2000. And as well, he's also had executive roles in the Wild Rose Party of Alberta. And he still has his foot in Alberta politics ever since. And we'll be talking about his new book called The Sovereigntists Handbook, which is out and available now on Amazon.ca and CoreyMorgan.com. So he will be with us next week, talking a little bit about, obviously, sovereignty and independence. And I'd also like to acknowledge the volunteers that we have for APP charter groups, setting up events, even doing webinars and social media, etc. If you'd like to become a volunteer, by all means, please reach out to albertaprosperityproject.com on the website and tell them that you'd like to volunteer. And with that, I would like to wish you a fabulous rest of the evening, and we hope to see you in an event in person or online again very soon. Take care. God bless, and we'll see you soon. Thank you very much. Good night, everybody.
Thanks.
Of course, I'm running the show here, so I actually have to finish this. There we go. Good night, everybody.